Hallo und willkommen zum 44. Video von 3 Minuten Deutsch. Today I'll be talking about more of the past tense stuff, but this time I will be talking about modal auxiliaries, and I will be talking about both the present perfect tense, das Perfekt, and the simple past tense, das Imperfekt. Let's start with the present perfect tense because it is easier. All of the modal auxiliaries will use a form of haben, and the past participles are generally kind of regular. Mögen becomes gemocht. Müssen becomes gemusst. Dürfen becomes gedurft. Können becomes gekonnt. Sollen becomes gesollt. Wollen becomes gewollt. Realistically, you are only going to be using these forms of the modal auxiliaries when you don't have another verb with them. This means that the sentence that you are more than likely going to say is relatively simple. You may never see the present perfect forms of certain modal auxiliaries until you get to some more complicated sentences. Let's stick with some simple examples for today. Ich habe das Spaghetti nicht gemocht. I didn't like the spaghetti. Hast du nicht gemusst? Didn't you have to go? Most likely asking some kid if they had to go to the bathroom because they didn't go before, even though you asked them, hey, don't you have to go to the bathroom? But now it's more like a, didn't you have to go before, and now you don't have to go, and what happened to that? If you have children, you'll understand. Hat das nicht gedurft. He wasn't allowed to do that. Probably never gonna see the verb gedurft. Sie hat gekonnt. She was able to. Das Kind hat das nicht gesollt. The child shouldn't have. Wir haben das nicht gewollt. We didn't want that. Honestly, I would probably only ever use gewollt and gemocht. The rest of them I would only use in the simple past tense instead. This mostly has to do with the fact that the other modals don't lend themselves to being used without an extra verb added. But mögen and wollen do. For some reason it just seems weird to me whenever I say gedurft or gesollt. If you do end up using another verb with a modal auxiliary in the present perfect tense, you could end up using both the modal and the other verb as the infinitive at the end of the sentence. The other verb comes first and then the modal verb, but they are both placed at the end of the sentence. Here are a few examples of that. Ich habe das Spiel nicht mögen dürfen. I wasn't allowed to like the game. This is an example of using two modals in the same sentence, but that's a topic for another video. You might use this particular sentence if your parents forbade you from playing a particular game because of its violence and if you are explaining to your friends why you don't like the game. Hast du nicht gehen müssen? Didn't you have to go? Notice that even though we use the verb gehen, we still use hast instead of bist. This is because of the modal. Hat den Kuchen nicht essen dürfen. He wasn't allowed to eat the cake. Sie hat nicht fliegen können. She couldn't fly. Das Kind hat den Kuchen nicht essen sollen. The child was not supposed to eat the cake. Wir haben das Geschenk nicht kaufen wollen. We didn't want to buy the gift. As you can see, those sentences were a bit complicated. In order to make this simpler, some Germans will avoid using the present perfect tense when speaking and will instead use the simple past tense, which removes the need for 3 verbs in a sentence. This does present a few other issues, however. The conjugation is a bit strange for the modal auxiliaries in the simple past tense. Essentially, they have the te endings that are standard for all regular verbs in the simple past tense, but since we haven't covered that in this series yet, it may be a little bit confusing. For now, just memorize the conjugation that I have on the screen, or download the conjugation chart that I have linked in the description. Here are the same examples as before, but in the simple past tense, so you can see how much easier this is to use. Ich durfte das Spiel nicht mögen. I wasn't allowed to like the game. Musstest du nicht gehen? Didn't you have to go? Durfte den Kuchen nicht essen. He wasn't allowed to eat the cake. Sie konnte nicht fliegen. She couldn't fly. Das Kind sollte den Kuchen nicht essen. The child should not have eaten the cake. Wir wollten das Geschenk nicht kaufen. We didn't want to buy the gift. I could go into more detail about this topic, but I think this video is already long enough to disqualify it from its own title, so instead I will just direct you to my blog, where you can find more information and a more in-depth look at this topic. Das ist alles für heute. Danke fürs Zuschauen. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss.